Hello again. I hope you are all coping well with your quarantine. Staying locked up, spending way too much time sitting in front of this screen. But we'll do a little bit more here. So the next two lectures are going to deal with unpacking some other consequences of Leibniz's predicate and notion principle. And we're going to go at it in a couple of different ways. So um, let's start with this question. Because last time I gave you the predicate and notion principle and expressed it in these two different ways. But these two different ways don't seem to be equivalent. In fact, Leibniz thinks they are, and that's what we need to unpack first. So in one place he says, the complete or perfect notion of an individual substance contains all of its predicates, past, present, and future. But then he makes an even grander claim elsewhere. He says every individual substance contains in its perfect notion the entire universe and everything that exists in it, past, present, and future. So how are these equivalent? Well, here's the short answer. Remember, Leibniz thinks relations aren't real, that relations reduce to properties of things. There are no extrinsic denominations. But then if the complete or perfect notion of me contains all of my predicates, past, present, and future, then it must also be the case that contained in the perfect notion of Curry is the entire universe and everything that exists in it, past, present, and future. Here's why. I have some relation to everything else in the universe. I am, for example, X number of miles from Alpha Centauri. I am to the left of a whole shitload of things. I am a son of this and an uncle of that. I am greater than this and lesser than that, etc., 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 right? In fact, if you think about it, I am related to every other thing in the universe at each moment of my existence, as are you and everything else, right? But relations aren't real. So what this translates into for Leibniz is that I have a property of being X number of miles from Alpha Centauri. I have the property of being to the left of my Gatorade bottle, right? I have the property of being the son of Thomas F. Curry, etc. So each substance is infinite. Yeah? And as anything changes in the universe, so too my concept must change in order to reflect that change. As you walk past me, for example, I lose the property of being to the left of you and gain the property of being to the right of you. And of course, your properties change respectively as well. So this is kind of weird, right? But it's a weirdness. This is a weirdness that we are going to return to when we examine the monadology. Not next lecture, but lecture after next. Ask yourself, does all this sound eerily Spinozistic? So too is our next worry. So today I want to focus on another weirdness that arises from the predicate and notion principle. Because think about it, if all truth is analytic truth, and if all of my properties, past, present, and future, are included in the very idea of me, then it seems as if I couldn't have any properties other than those I do have. But someone might insist that his nature or form corresponds to this notion, Leibniz says. And since God has imposed this personality on him, it is henceforth necessary for him to satisfy it. That is, this objector might say, by making all true propositions analytic, mustn't Leibniz also make them all necessary propositions? And if so, then does Leibniz follow Spinoza in denying that there are any such things as contingent truths? So the short answer is no. Leibniz is desperately determined to preserve contingent truth, and thereby to preserve a robust notion of freedom of the will. Recall, he also says that properly speaking, God did not decide that Peter sin, or that Judas be damned, but only that Peter, who would sin with certainty, though not with necessity but freely, and Judas, who would suffer damnation, would attain existence rather than other possible things. So the long answer then requires us to unpack what Leibniz could mean here. So here's what he's saying. Peter will sin with certainty. After all, it's part of the very idea of Peter that he sinned, though not with necessity, but freely. So how could that be? How does certainty not imply necessity? To see what Leibniz is up to here, we have to return to the discourse, section 13, that we examined a little bit at the end of the last lecture. In that passage, he draws a distinction between what he calls elsewhere absolutely necessary assertions or statements or truths, and hypothetically necessary statements or assertions or truths. So this is what we need to unpack. He says, whatever happens in conformity with these predeterminations, with the very idea of me, right, is certain but not necessary. And if one were to do the contrary, he would not be doing something impossible in itself, even though it would be impossible for this to happen. Wait a minute. So, it's certain that Peter will sin, but not necessary. And if Peter were to not sin, he would not be doing something impossible in itself, even though it is in fact impossible for Peter to not sin. Whew. Okay, let's see what we can do with this. He continues. For if someone were able to carry out the whole demonstration by virtue of which he could prove this connection between the subject, Caesar, and the predicate, that is, if I could really unpack the whole notion of Caesar, the predicate, his successful undertaking, he would in fact be showing that Caesar's future dictatorship is grounded in his notion or his nature, and that there is a reason why he crossed the Rubicon rather than stopped at it, and why he won rather than lost at Pharsalus, and that it was reasonable and consequently certain that this should happen. But this would not show that it was necessary in itself, nor that the contrary implies a contradiction. That is, it is only hypothetically necessary that Caesar crossed the Rubicon, not absolutely necessary. And here's the distinction. To say that an event or a property is absolutely necessary is to say that its denial involves a contradiction. Absolutely necessary propositions are governed by the principle of contradiction. To say that an event or a property is hypothetically necessary is to say that its denial does not imply a contradiction. Such events or properties are contingent events or properties. That is, Leibniz wants to distinguish between, for example, 2 + 2 = 4, or bachelors or unmarried men, both of which are absolutely necessary, right? Because they are absolutely necessary, because to deny that a bachelor is an unmarried man is to contradict yourself. To deny that 2 + 2 = 4 is to contradict oneself. So compare those with curry is bald or all swans are white. These are hypothetical necessities, because in these cases, denying the predicate of the subject does not generate a contradiction. Right? Denying that curry is bald, denying that all swans are white is not contradictory. Neither are contradictory. He says, for it will be found that the demonstration of this predicate of Caesar is not as absolute as those of numbers or of geometry, remember 2 + 2 = 4, but that it supposes the sequence of things that God has freely chosen, a sequence based on God's first decree always to do what is most perfect. But every truth based on these kinds of decrees is contingent, even though it is certain. For these decrees do not change the possibility of things. And as I have already said, even though it is certain that God always chooses the best, this does not prevent something less perfect from being and remaining possible in itself, even though it will not happen, since it is not its impossibility, but its imperfection which causes it to be rejected. And nothing is necessary whose contrary is possible. Okay, very, very clever. So the difference seems to be that in the one case, God chose what was the best from among various possibilities. In the other case, God didn't have a choice. So God cannot create square circles. He can't create a sheet of paper which is red all over and black all over at the same time, right? And it's not that this is a limitation on his power. The very idea of a square circle is incomprehensible. It's not thinkable. So, God himself isn't able to do what is logically absolutely impossible. He could not have created an incomprehensible, contradictory world without himself possessing contradictory properties, and that's absurd. But not so with regard to hypothetical necessities. They depend upon his will. How so? Well, remember that passage about Peter and Judas. The complete or perfect notion of an individual contains all of its predicates, past, present, and future, right? So everything that will happen to Peter or Judas, both necessary and free, is contained in the perfect individual notion of Peter or Judas, etc., 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 considered in the realm of possibility by withdrawing the mind from the divine decree of creating him. And from this it is obvious that God chose from an infinite number of possible individuals those he thought most in accord with the supreme and hidden ends of his wisdom. And then we have this passage again, right? He did not decide that Peter sin or that Judas be damned, only that the Peter who would sin is the one that he would in fact create. So what's going on here? Well, think about God sitting around prior to creation. There are an infinite number of worlds, possible worlds that God could have created, right? Of all the possible worlds God could have created, he created just one. Count your blessings. He created the one with you in it, and this you in it. So what God did in creating the world was to choose from an infinite number of possible individuals, those he thought, as that passage said, most in accord with the supreme and hidden ends of his wisdom. Hence, his decision to create this world was a free act on his part. Of course, he created the world with the bald rather than the hairy curry. And since he created this world, it unfolds according to his plan and is in that sense certain. But he could have created a different world, or none at all. And hence it is, in this sense, contingent or hypothetical. In Leibniz's words, we will therefore be in a position to satisfy these sorts of difficulties, however great they may appear, as long as we recognize that all contingent propositions have reasons to be one way rather than another. Okay? But they do not have necessary demonstrations, since these reasons for being one way rather than another are based only on the principle of contingency, or the principle of the existence of things, that is, based on what is or appears to be best from among several equally possible things. On the other hand, necessary truths are based on the principle of contradiction, and on the possibility or impossibility of essences themselves, without regard to the free will of God or his creatures. They are contingent because God could have created something other. Voila. The problem is brilliantly solved. Or is it? Because can't we ask here why God creates this world? There has to be some reason why God created this world out of all of the possible worlds he could have created. Remember the principle of sufficient reason. So what possible reason could there be for his having created the world with this curry of all the possible curries, or with curry at all, and this you of all the possible yous, or you at all? Okay. So, can you find some clues to this answer in slides 6 and 7 and 9, and in Finding the answer to the question, you may also uncover what some scholars think is another of Leibniz's primary truths. All right. Now, his answer to this question raises a whole bunch of other issues, and those issues will be discussed in the next lecture. Until then, take good care, stay safe, stay locked up. We'll see you soon.